Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us for session 5 of the Hazelnut Academy. And tonight we're going to be talking about harvesting and processing. And this may seem a long way off for some of you that perhaps are just putting in your first plants or maybe even in the planning stages. But I assure you, it will get here quicker than you think. That's for sure. Let's see, our agenda for tonight. We're going to start with an overview of harvesting, and then I want to move into processing just a little bit so that you can get a feel for what it takes to get from these round in-shell nuts growing in the husk to then the eventual kernels. Okay, we're going to start with ripeness. So in this section, we'll talk about ripening and then the timing of the harvest, as well as harvesting methods and some operations. And I want to be clear up front that this is not all inclusive. There's a lot to learn about harvesting, and some of that research is actually going on right now and will even be presented on at the upcoming Upper Midwest Hazelnut Growers Conference coming up in 2 weeks, actually, March 4th here in Decorah, Iowa. So what I'm going to share with you this evening is some of my experiences with harvesting and processing. Again, this is but one perspective, but I think it'll provide the necessary context for you as you get a feel for what to expect when it comes to harvesting your shrubs. So I hope you come away with a couple of things. First of all, a better understanding of when and how to harvest your hazelnut shrubs. Various harvesting methods depending on your size and scale, the steps to get from in-shell nuts in the husk to then those valuable kernels, and then a better understanding of the costs associated with getting the crop harvested and husked, ready for sale or processing. So we return to our goals once again. What is our harvesting goal? Well, I would argue that we're looking to beat the squirrels to the prize. That is to say, we get the nuts before the squirrels do. More realistically, and perhaps a similar goal is going to be to get the nuts harvested before they fall to the ground. Now, if your goal is to vacuum up all the nuts off the floor of the orchard, then that might impact how you go about your business of harvesting and the strategy that you use. Ultimately, we want to get the nuts harvested and dried down enough to husk them for long-term storage and curing. That's kind of the name of the game. You know, with the harvesting right now, because of the open pollinated seedlings, we're looking at a harvest window of roughly 3 to 6 weeks. I would imagine that as we get to cultivars, those cultivars will have a much narrower ripening range. However, I fully anticipate that with multiple cultivars within a planting, that harvest window might still run for several weeks, a month or so. Now, harvesting can't happen until the nuts are ripe and ready to pick. And how do we know when they're ripe? How do we know when the whole shrub is ripe and ready to pick? In the bigger picture, how does the harvesting of hazelnuts impact other crops that I may need to harvest? Hey, these are all great questions, and let's dive into them in reverse order. So, for my location in northern Iowa, approximately 30 miles from the Minnesota border, we are always harvesting by Labor Day weekend. Often before that, starting in maybe August, but always we're harvesting by Labor Day. And then the picking is going to wrap up sometime maybe in October, depending on the growing season. And so one of the things that I want to show with this little video that should be coming up here now is a little bit on ripeness. So as you can see, all of these nut clusters are starting to turn from green to brown. And while that can be an indication, that is certainly not enough to determine if a cluster is ripe and ready. So what we ultimately want to do is we want to test a couple of those clusters from all over that shrub, high, low, inside, outside. And what we're testing for is to see if that nut will actually come loose from the involucre. The involucre is just another name for husk. And as you can see in the video here, that nut does pop free, essentially. It abscisses, we call that, from the husk. You can see where it is attached to that husk, where it's taking in nutrients and moisture. And so if we take and we peel back that involucre or that husk, and then we push on that nut with our thumb, if it pops free, it's okay and it's ripe and ready to go. Now, if we look at the color of the nut inside of that husk, you can see that these are kind of brown in color. They're going to start out a creamy white color, and then eventually, as they ripen, turn into that brown color. But that coloration is kind of tricky. So honestly, by and large, they are going to be brown when we go in there and peel back that husk and pop them open, but they can be a really light brown, just turning from that creamy white to that brown. So the bottom line is you want to get in there with your thumb, see if you can pop that nut free, and then keep in mind you need to go all the way around that shrub and test several of those nut clusters on the north side, the south side, so that you can get a feeling for if the entire shrub is ripe and ready to go, instead of just a couple of the nut clusters. So I wanted to talk a little bit, shifting gears to some of the harvesting methods. And machine harvest is more or less split into machines that are going to harvest the row in some way, shape, or form, like maybe the over-the-row blueberry harvesters or the grape harvesters or even the olive harvesters. Or alternatively, we might be looking at machines that actually vacuum up the nuts from the orchard floor or sweep them up in some way, shape, or form. And then, of course, hand harvesting. So let's just get this out of the way. Hand harvesting is, as the name implies, hand harvesting. We're hand picking the nut clusters from the shrub. And that is how almost all of us will start out. And for the time being, that's what many of us are doing right now, including myself. I don't have access to a mechanical, either blueberry harvester or one of those types of machines. And so we do pick everything by hand, all of those nut clusters right from the shrub itself. And so here we have one of the BEI machines. These are blueberry harvesters that will actually run over the row, the hedgerow of blueberries, or in this case, hazelnuts. And so what happens here is there's inside of that machine these almost like rakes, these fingers that go back and forth, and they kind of beat on the shrub just a little bit to knock the clusters off to the bottom of the machine, where then some catcher pans will actually catch the nut clusters, and then a conveyor belt will convey them to the back of the machine where totes can be loaded onto it. It does have a blowing system to blow out some of the leaves and the sticks and some things like that. But again, it's primarily been produced for things like blueberries, although it does work. We have some growers that do have one of the older machines, but they do work for hazelnuts. Of course, if your plants are too large to fit into the machine, that can be a problem. If the structure of the plant is such that it doesn't really go through the machine very well, that can be a problem. So that is to say that we still need some plants that are maybe machine harvestable. But if we can get some of these plants, we do have a mechanism by which we can mechanically harvest them. This is a really interesting tool right here. So this is called the PaddyVac. So the PaddyVac is a piece of equipment that I saw at the University of Missouri, their agroforestry center, where they have several nut orchard research sites. And what they did was, this is a commercial unit. You can kind of see there, it's got a big 5 horsepower motor on it with a blower to create vacuum. And it was, again, PaddyVac is the name, and it was really developed and marketed to horse owners so that they could drive out with their mower or a little tractor, pull this behind, and then suck up the horse turds or the horse apples on their picturesque pastures. And so the thought was, well, if it can suck up a horse apple or a horse turd, it can suck up a chestnut burr. And so the University of Missouri bought a couple of these units, modified them to get them to set them up higher so that you could get a 55-gallon drum underneath them. You can kind of see from the picture there that latching system. What happens is the back end of that big blue hub-like area will swing open, and then the whole machine can be tilted back to dump its payload out. And they did a scientific study, a research, a competition of sorts, where they put this machine up against the other high-tech piece of technology for harvesting chestnuts, and that is the nut wizards, which are the rolling baskets, the rolling wire baskets. And would you believe it? In the end, the rolling wire baskets actually won out. They did a better job than these machines. Now, interestingly enough, here's why. As you can see, these are very powerful machines. They have, is that a 4-inch hose, pickup hose? And so this machine did a great job of sucking up all of the chestnut burrs and chestnuts, but it also sucked up leaves and sticks and dirt. And so some of the folks at the research site there said that one of the engines actually blew up because the machine got clogged up with so much dirt and debris and stuff. And so then when you go ahead and dump that payload out of chestnut burrs and chestnuts, it's all full of dirt and all sorts of other stuff. And so the consensus was that the rolling wire baskets, the nut wizards, those are the most high-tech pieces of equipment for harvesting chestnuts today. Well, so when I saw this, I thought to myself, hey, I think that might work for hazelnuts. And so I went out and I tried to find the biggest shop vac that I could find. And the key here was that it's the hose. So with the 2-inch hose here, which I got with this shop vac, I was able to suck up most hazelnut clusters. And again, that's what I was interested in, is sucking up the hazelnut clusters. I think it might be a fool's errand to try and go and actually suck up individual nuts, little round, marbles essentially on the ground. But if the entire cluster falls to the ground and a cluster's got 3, 5, 6 nuts in it, that might be worth sucking up. And so it did a pretty good job of sucking up those nut clusters that were small enough to fit within that 2-inch hose. So ultimately, it'd be nice to have a little bit larger unit that you could dedicate to sweep or to sucking up the nuts. And then more recently, some growers in Wisconsin and Minnesota purchased some of these units. These are the Hazelnut units. I think they're from Turkey or someplace in Europe. And so these are PTO driven units, so attached to a small tractor. And they are going to have a large pickup hose. I think it's a 4-inch hose where they can just suck up just about everything that's on the orchard floor there. And then it has some different baffles and some blowers to blow out some of the sticks and the leaves and things like that. And then I think it even has some sizing holes in there to do some initial sizing, and maybe even husking against maybe a rasbar or something. We'll have to get some video of this, and hopefully the folks, I think there might actually be some at the MidwestHazelnuts.org website of the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative. So would certainly encourage folks to see if they could find it in action. And I should probably get that included in this presentation as well. Well, those are some of the mechanical options, certainly. One of the things that we tried early on was, could we put down some tarps and then shake these shrubs and see if we could shake most of the nut clusters off. And again, that kind of worked to a certain extent, not real well, and there's not a real good way to kind of move that tarp around. In this particular picture, we took a 16-foot hog panel and wrapped it in the tarp there, and then kind of pulled it along essentially. But again, it didn't really work all that well. And part of the reason is that as you look at this entire row of hazelnuts here, the whole row isn't ripe and ready to go. Some of those shrubs are ripe, some aren't. And so, if we had a whole a whole row of shrubs that were ripening at about the same time, some of these things might be a little bit more feasible because you could get the whole row essentially. But ultimately, we're harvesting by hand. Again, we're picking individual nut clusters off of the shrub itself. Even if the shrub is 10, 12 foot tall, we'll bend over those top stems, pull them down, and then get access to those nut clusters that might be growing up top. Well, this is going to be a great time for me to wet my whistle real quick here. So just want to talk, looking to talk a little bit about size and scale. And so all growers are going to basically progress in stages as their operation grows. Most likely, you're going to begin with like onion sacks that you can pick into and then use those onion sacks to dry down your nut clusters. Eventually, you might outgrow that system and then start drying in larger totes or 55-gallon drums or even unused grain bins. And that's what we actually dry our nuts down in today. So here is something that a lot of growers are going to be familiar with, and this is just picking nut clusters into those onion sacks and then letting them just sit out in the sun, in the wind to dry down. Now, a couple of things here. One is don't fill your onion sacks too full so that the air can't circulate and so that those nut clusters in the center of that bag, we want to be sure they get a chance to get air onto them so they don't mold. It's nice to get them up and off the ground. This was a simple rack made with some T-posts and again, a 16-foot hog panel. And what we would do is just come through basically every day and just flip those bags from top to bottom. We let them stay out in all the conditions. So if it rains, they get rained on. But again, even if they get rained on heavily, they dry out pretty quickly. And so a method like this is more or less free. The sun and the nice cool temperatures and the dry air in the fall is free. But there's limitations in terms of just the size and scale again, the number of drying racks. The biggest issue for me actually was security because I would get all sorts of critters that would get in there and get to the nuts and just destroy these onion sacks. And that's how I actually discovered that blue jays are one of my biggest pest issues. I had found some bags just utterly ripped apart, thought it was a raccoon or maybe some squirrels, but then I caught the blue jays in the act. They were right there on top of the purple bags, and they'd stick their beak inside of there and just thrash back and forth with their heads and their beaks and just rip open the bags and fly off with the nuts. So yeah, I don't like blue jays. But this is going to be a great option for growers as they get started. Eventually, you're going to graduate to 55-gallon drums like this. And then if you have access to a drying bin, a grain drying bin of some sort, that's going to be another great option. So just a little bit of context. This is a grain drying bin that has a slotted floor. And then there's a giant fan that's going to blow either ambient air up through the bottom, through those slits, or it does have, of course, when the corn is in there, propane to be able to dry the corn down from whatever moisture it's coming in from the field down to, well, 14, 12%, whatever it is, somewhere in there. We do not put any heat on the hazelnuts here. We just blow ambient air up through them, again, to get them dried down. One of the nice things about the grain bin here, and you can see it's relatively full at this stage of the game, is that it actually is like it's a little storage shed for the hazelnuts. So no squirrels or raccoons or blue jays are getting in here. There are some mice, and that's just part of the trade-off. But they are relatively protected. We can close the door, lock it up, and run some air through there. And even anymore, that big old fan, it sucks a lot of juice blowing air. And so last year we only ran the fan maybe 3 or 4 times when it was kind of really humid and we wanted to get the air moving. Otherwise, it was enough to just have the cool, dry air of the fall dry those nuts down. And so you can imagine that floor space is pretty in demand. And so what happens is we'll dump out some of the barrels of the nut clusters. We'll let them dry down, and as they dry, we'll continually push up to the edge. And so by the end of the season, we do have a big ring around the outside where we've been pushing up and piling up those dried clusters before we put them through the Super Squirrel Husker. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about harvesting. So believe it or not, there is something of a method to the madness when it comes to picking nuts from the shrub. And the first thing I want to point out is that you're really picking with your hands. If you think you're just going to visually identify and see the nut clusters, you are sorely mistaken. And so use your hands feeling underneath the branches for the nut clusters hanging there. And then you're going to want to search the entire shrub, certainly, but just understand that it's amazing how many times, the 3 to 6 main branches of that shrub might contain just about all of the nuts on the bush. And so keep that in mind as you're spending time trying to get every last nut. Be efficient and get those main stems first, and then reevaluate, and is it worth getting in there to get that last little bit? How much time is it really going to take you, right? When I say be efficient, the other thing I want to mention too is pick a starting point. So when I'm teaching new pickers how to pick, I tell them to pick a starting point, pick a stem, and then pick those nut clusters, follow that back to where it meets a bigger stem, and then pick that entire stem, follow that back all the way to a bigger stem until it might be the whole stem that goes down into the ground. And then that's your starting point, and then move around that shrub either clockwise or counterclockwise, and move methodically. Don't just be, again, wherever you see nut clusters, you're reaching out and grabbing them. Have a distinct starting point so that you know that, okay, I've already picked here. I can move on and keep track of where I'm at. So I have a nice little video here that's going to give just, it's a nice way to just kind of see how we do it. Again, we're using our hands to really feel underneath a lot of times the leaves where the nut clusters are just kind of hanging there. And you can see I'm always moving my hands. Because you'll feel them. You will feel them. And you can see I kind of started at that one point and then started to move around the shrub. Again, here I can just feel as I on the underside. And this is especially true on those lower branches. So on those lower branches where you're not going to get down to be able to see them, that's where you really utilize your hands to just. And then here we go. This is the other thing. If you do a little twist when you pick that nut cluster, it can really help it pop off. And then the other thing to keep in mind is high and low. So you're going to get all of those nut clusters that are on that particular stem there. Even if they're 10, 12 feet tall, you can bend them over, put them right over the top of the bucket there, and then just strip those nut clusters off. And then pick the next one, bend it down, get them all those nuts stripped off of there. And off we go. Holy moly, just kicked it into high gear there. Must have just had my coffee. So that is picking, and it is something that we're all going to do in some way, shape, or form at some level, even if we do eventually graduate from it. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about processing. And before we get too deep into processing, I think we need to have a short discussion on terminology so that we all kind of know what I'm talking about as I move through the various stages of processing. So from the stages of processing, we're going to move into the processing challenges, as well as some of then the equipment for processing hazelnuts. And then we're going to wrap up with a little demonstration of sorts of how we do things at Hazel Acres and Nut Haven. And then, of course, I have some quiz questions again. So terminology-wise, these are what we would call whole, cleaned, in-shell nuts. Whole, cleaned in-shell nuts. So these are the in-shell nuts that'll be inside of those husks. The husks have all been removed, and so these are whole, cleaned in-shell nuts. Now, this is what we call half crack, and this is material that's gone through the cracker, but only a little bit or half of that shell has been removed. And oftentimes there's still some kernel that's left inside of that shell that doesn't fall free. And so something needs to be done with these. They either need to go back through the cracker or they need to be marketed like this in some way, shape, or form. But these are what we call half cracks. And then you can see on the far left-hand side of your screen, those are kernels. So that's what we're looking to get. That's what's inside of the shell. And that's what's 50% oil by weight, monounsaturated, one of our healthiest oils, almost identical to olive oil. If you look on the right-hand side there, you can see three distinct piles. At the top, you can see a pile of shells and shell fragment pieces. Below that, you'll see a white paper plate, and that will have one pile, which is the more or less whole kernels, and then the other side is going to be your splits and your little pieces of kernel, and that's all got to be separated out. Then we have the stick-ons, and stick-on is a name that we give to those in-shell nuts that just have a little piece of the husk that's still stuck to it for whatever reason. And keep in mind that it's very plausible that when you go to pick an entire shrub and it's more or less ripe, there may be a handful of nut clusters within that shrub that aren't ripe. And so because they're not ripe, they're going to be firmly connected or seated to that husk. And so no matter what you do, because that's not a ripe nut yet, there's basically nothing you can do to get that piece of husk off. But that's okay to a certain extent, because oftentimes, if that's a problem that persists, that is to say, if the husk is truly stuck onto the nut, it almost always is an indication that it's not a mature or ripe nut, and so that the kernel inside is going to be either deformed or underdeveloped, whatever the case may be. But we want to get these out of there. And the reasons we want to get these out of there is because they have that little bit of husk on them. And so that can be a problem for encouraging mold when we're long-term storaging. It can be a problem downstream in the processing side of things. So we want to try to minimize stick-ons, and then as best as we can, get them out of there as well. And then, of course, we're going to have the chaff. So this is the husk material. Of course, as it dries down, it loses moisture and it really turns brown and brittle. And that's why I use the term chaff, because it really does seem to break down into this chaff material. So the goal is pretty simple. It's pretty simple and straightforward, pardon me. We want to get to these, from these clusters to in-shell nuts, and then eventually to kernels to sell or for value-added processing. So a few of these processing challenges, and this is relative to post-husk, so after we've husked, we need to sort out those stick-ons. We also need to separate out and dry down some of those green husks, figure out a way to remove some of those blanks. And then if we have any cracked nuts, so that is to say nuts that may have been cracked because they went through the husker or for whatever reason, we want to get those removed, because they're going to be an opening into the shell, into that kernel on the inside, for mold and fungus and other things to get in there as they're drying down and curing long term after harvest. Then we have some processing challenges after we crack them. And so that's how, after they've been cracked, now we have to separate all of the kernels and the shell pieces. We want to try to enhance the split recovery. Certainly want to try to automate as much of it as we can. and then the identification and removal of those damaged or bad nuts. I'd like to spend just a few minutes talking about some of the processing pieces of equipment because I think it's fascinating, and some of them are pieces of equipment that you will use as you endeavor on processing your own nuts down the road. So this is a commercial machine by Southern Nut and Tree. It is a Husker, and it is a beast. And so you pour the nuts into the top of the machine, and it basically uses this wire brush that rotates rapidly to just rip apart the husk and the nuts. And then it all falls through a grate. And now you still have to separate the husk from the in-shell nuts. And so one of the things you can do with this machine is it doesn't matter if the nuts are in the husk and the husk is still green and moist and fleshy, or if you've already dried them down into a nice brittle, chaff, this machine will just rip them all to shreds. Of course, if you've dried down the husks into the chaff, it's fairly easy to just suck off that light chaff. When you have pieces of husk full of moisture, it doesn't have the same density differential, and so it can be a little bit more challenging. And so you got to figure out some way to separate that husk from the in-shell nuts if you're going to do green husking and stuff like that. This is the Super SQUIRREL Husker, and this does work best with the dried nuts, dried husks, I should say, and it can do over 100 pounds an hour, and it does have an air vacuum that's used on the end that'll suck off then those pieces of chaff. And I've got a video at the end of the presentation here to show you more about this particular piece of equipment. Now, this is a fascinating story because when I went to Iowa State University and consulted with some of the folks at the seed conditioning lab there, I brought in some samples of some of the problems that we had. And so I brought in a 5-gallon bucket of the stick-ons. And I said, one of the challenges we have is the amount of time that we're spending just hand sorting these stick-ons out to get them out of there. And so the gentleman looked at the bucket and he said, "Oh, well, what you need is that piece of machinery right there." And it was the one I was standing next to, and it was this piece of equipment. And so I turned and I looked at it, and as soon as I looked at it, I thought to myself, "Aha, I know how this works. And furthermore, I can build one of these." And so what this unit is a Westrup belt separator. And so it's able to separate some of the husk and stick-ons from those clean in-shell nuts. And it's really, really straightforward. The picture that you're seeing there has a hopper with a vibrating or a mechanical feeder that'll feed a nice stream of nuts onto then a belt. Think of it as a treadmill. And that treadmill is actually inclined. And so what happens is your material will fall onto the treadmill. And what happens is round things roll. And so they will roll to the bottom of the treadmill, and flat things don't roll. And so if it's a flat piece of husk or a stick-on where it's not perfectly cylindrical, it will essentially land on that belt and it will settle where the flat spot is, and then it'll stop rolling, and then it'll just be carried off to the end of the belt and deposited into a bucket. And so sure enough, I have built several of these using old treadmills, and it works just slicker than snot. And it is one of those stories that I love to tell because, again, I was like a kid in the candy store when I got to go to the Iowa State to their seed conditioning lab with all the various pieces of equipment that are in there, and getting to see how they all work and how they could be utilized for the applications that we have for hazelnuts. So anyways, so here's what the results are of that, the belt separator. This is the round or the good stuff. And again, these are like little round marbles that are going to roll down that treadmill to the bottom. This is going to be your oblong or flat stuff that gets discarded and dumped off the end of the belt. So then we can take that same concept of that belt and do one of these, which is the Harada belt separator. And so now we take that belt and we tilt it. And by tilting that belt, we can run the material across it, and we can get several different cuts or fractions, where the length of the belt, the tilt of the belt, all of those are going to make a difference. The speed of the belt, and then how those round objects eventually either roll or don't roll into the various categories. And so again, this is an example of what those nice round nuts in one of the first categories would look like. Then you can see the next category where you got a few of those stick-ons in there yet because they were relatively cylindrical and round and could still kind of roll. And then you got a lot of the flat ones. And so the surprise here was that as many of the nice, clean in-shell nuts found their way into this category as the other ones. But basically, this Harada is just an opportunity to get a finer cut versus just round and not round. And then, of course, this was the oblong stuff that was would need to be run through again or separated out. Okay, this piece of equipment is really cool. This is a gravity table used in the peanut industry, and that's where actually this machine came from, was an old peanut factory. And what it does is it creates, it takes your solid material, in this case, your mix of whole in-shell nuts and husks and husk pieces and all that, and it turns it into a fluid. And once it turns that solid into a fluid through air blowing up and through the vibrating mechanism of the machine, it's able to separate then those constituents into light, medium, and heavy fractions. And so this picture kind of shows that. So the material would come in from the machine. Well, it's in the right in my picture here, but where there's a hopper there, a beige hopper, and that's where all of your material is going to be deposited. And then that deck, that orange piece there, is vibrating back and forth. Air is blowing up from the bottom, and it makes those nuts and those stick-ons and everything almost act like a fluid. And because of that, then the heavier stuff starts to separate out towards the left-hand side here, and some of the lighter stuff towards the right-hand side. And so it's another way to get us this kind of separation. And so this is the light fraction. This is going to be, again, most of those chaff husk pieces. Some of those nuts that are in there are probably going to be blank because they were, again, the light fraction. Here's going to be your medium fraction, which is going to be mostly in-shell nuts with a few of those stick-ons. And then finally, here's your heavy fraction, which is most likely going to be all good quality nuts with good kernels. Finally, this cool piece of equipment here is a color sorter, and it has the ability to optically detect some differences. When you pour a stream of material across it, it can identify things like kernel from shell. It can identify things like damaged kernels from good quality kernels. And so this is a really valuable piece of equipment to be able to utilize after you've done some of those other mechanical processes. This is not a substitute for hand inspection, so that is a set of eyes, but this can really do a nice job of taking out some of those damaged pieces. And all of these pieces of equipment, it should be mentioned, all of them are designed or utilized in a way to just try to reduce or minimize the amount of hand inspection that we have to do. Excuse me. Okay, another nice little video here. This is the roller sizer. And so this is one of the ways that we're going to go ahead and size the nuts so that we can get them into size classes before we're going to put them through the cracker. And so this has a vibratory feeder that'll feed the nuts onto two stainless steel rollers that are gapped. So at one end, they're almost touching. At the other end, they're wide open. And the nuts will just travel along between those two. And once it gets to the point where it falls free, it'll just fall through. And this is a relatively quick and easy and can do a pretty high volume of sorting out those nuts into some various size classes. It can also be used in conjunction after after the nuts have been cracked, you can also run it back through this machine to separate out those nuts that didn't get cracked, so the nice whole in-shell nuts yet, from the kernels and the kernel pieces and some things like that. So it can be used in a couple of different ways. Mighty fine looking nuts, that's for sure. Okay, then we have to crack the nuts. And so here is a unit that I use. Certainly there are other crackers out there of all various sizes and scales, but this one is neat because you provide your own drill essentially, and you attach it to this the cracker and the hopper here, and then that's it. And I discovered this. One of the best agroforesters I know here in the Midwest, Tom Wall and Kathy Dice. Tom mentioned that his brother had one of these that he got for Christmas, and it could crack black walnuts. And of course, that's one of our toughest nuts to crack. And so I thought, well, if it can crack black walnuts, it can certainly crack hazelnuts. And so paid a visit to Tom's brother, and he showed off his unit, and I was sold. And so I bought one myself. And so let's again play just a little video here so that we can see how this actually works. So we got the old DeWalt hooked up to it, and it's spinning. Inside of there is a spindle that's just a rectangular piece of metal. And then on the back side, there's a swinging gate. And by moving that gate closer to the spindle or further away, that's how you get the gap that's necessary that corresponds to the size of the nut. And then, of course, as you gradually reduce that size or that distance between the spindle and the gate, that's the smaller and smaller nuts that you get. And you can see it does a pretty good job, about as fast as you can feed them in there. It's cracking them out. Of course, it won't crack all of them. You'll need to run them back through, basically recycle and crack as many as you can, and then separate out kernels and shells, and then eventually get down to a point where everything's been cracked. There's a little bit of an art to this because you want to minimize the half cracks, and you really want to maximize the full cracks. And if you don't have a very good size, then you can get larger nuts that will just explode, and you'll basically that's a lost nut then, because it's exploded into a lot of little pieces that probably won't be recoverable. Again, this is a relatively inexpensive unit. I think mine was $400. There are better crackers out there on the market for substantially more money, certainly in the commercial realm of things. I wanted to put this in there because this is at the University of Minnesota, and this is what ingenious grad students will do. So Lois Brown, of course, at the university, they're identity preserving and picking some specific shrubs so that they can do some selective crosses, or at the very least take some data on some shrubs over time to see how well they do. And so some students were getting sick and tired of having to husk by hand. And so one student said, hey, I have this old cake carrier. And so that's what that tub is that is apparently a plastic contraption that you would place a cake into to transport it to a cakewalk or a potluck or something like that. And so by putting it on its side and putting some nuts in there, and then fashioning a drill with some, I guess you could say, beater paddles or something in there, they're able to prop it up on its side, just run that drill and just beat those nut clusters to a pulp, and basically that's how they do some of their and this is, I did this with a 5-gallon bucket the first 2 years, or not first 2 years. The first 2 years I had substantial nuts, and I didn't want to sit in the basement with the leather gloves on husking by hand. And so it's not so far-fetched, and you just batch it, but you can get through the nuts pretty quickly. Okay, so I'll show you just a little bit how we do things at Nut Haven here with the Super Squirrel Husker. So again, these are nuts that have been dried down in the grain bin for a week or 2 weeks. So they're dry and they're brittle. They're light and chaffy. And so that material is going to go into the Super Squirrel Husker. Now that Super Squirrel Husker is nothing more than 2 conveyor belts stacked one on top of another. The bottom conveyor belt runs at a constant speed. The top conveyor belt can move at variable speeds. And so by having the belts move at 2 different speeds, it almost tumbles or turns the nuts and can break up the nut clusters and then break up the chaff. And then the whole mix is deposited onto that inverted treadmill there, where again, round things will roll and they'll roll to the bottom. And then any of those stick-on pieces or clusters that didn't get husked, they'll have a flat spot on them, and they just then get carried to the end of the conveyor belt there and dumped onto the end into a bucket to being recycled, put back through the system to continue and get them down to a point where it's only those that truly are stick-ons, that is to say, truly are not going to come off. And then the 55-gallon drum collects all of that chaff or that husk material. And as you can see, round things do roll. But this has saved just an immense amount of time. It can be integrated right into the husking process there. So this has been a real game changer in terms of just that initial cut to get things cleaned up and then get the nut clusters that didn't get husked to be able to put them back through the machine. And so through a reiterative process, we can get down to a pretty small amount of those ones that are, and then, so then that's squirrel food, essentially. Either that or sometimes they'll even be burned if I need to burn a stump. But that's squirrel food, those either blank nuts or nuts that are got the stick-ons on them. Let the squirrels see if there's anything worth getting into there. Okay. So then you've got to separate kernels from shells. And so one of the things you can do is convince your mother while she's watching Law and Order to just sort nuts for you. Something to do. Something to do. And Roger's not wearing his hairnet, so we'll have to get on him for that. And he just dropped a nut somewhere in the chair. So I laugh because these are my parents, Roger and Joyce Jensen, and they help me out quite often with just that final sort, that final hand sort that you have to do to be sure that you're not getting any shell pieces in with your kernels. Okay, before we wrap up, I thought it would be great to just hit on the enterprise worksheet once more. So harvesting and marketing, we have some different costs that we need to account for. One of them is just harvesting the nuts. And so one of the things that I do to try to get a handle on what it costs me, again, just to harvest these things, is I pay the pickers per 7-gallon bucket. So I'm paying them volumetrically. They're filling a 7-gallon bucket. Again, it's a 7-gallon bucket. And they get paid $5 a bucket. Now, I'm hoping that in that 7-gallon bucket, there's at least 5 pounds of in-shell nuts. And then that's how I get to that $5 for a bucket. Hopefully there'll be 5 pounds of in-shell nuts in there. But because I'm paying by the volume, I need to keep track across the harvest season. So what I'll do is I'll take sample bags every couple of days. And what that is so one of the workers picks a bag. So I'll put it into an onion sack and I'll dry that down separately so that I can come back. And I'll do that for 8, 10, 12 bags. And I'll do that so that during the winter, then I can come back and I can husk that bag by hand for the most part. And I can see did I really get 5 pounds worth of nuts in that bucket? Because early in the season, when you're picking clusters that are kind of green and fleshy and full of moisture, they just take up more space than when those clusters have dried down a little bit and might be kind of brittle and dry. And so, of course, I try to make sure that I at least have a 5 pounds in that 7 gallon bucket, and that's how I get to $1 per pound. But that's a hideous number. Um, $1 a pound just to harvest. Like that's it, just to harvest. And so we need to get that number down to like 30, 20 cents maybe. And that's where the hope is that with mechanical harvesting, we can hopefully get there, but not quite yet. Then some sort of a cost for drying. If you use the sun and the air in the onion sacks, that's free. If you have a big grain bin like I have, luckily for me, I'm able to utilize it because I'm done with it by the time the local farmer needs it for the corn crop. But it does take some electricity to turn on those big fans and blow a lot of air around. So it's not free, even though the space might be at no cost to me, the energy to blow that air. And so that's why I don't run it unless I absolutely have to. And then, of course, I don't have to buy any propane because we're not heating that air, just blowing ambient air over those clusters. Then we have to have some sort of a cost for husking. And so this is where I've put in a range of anywhere from 25 cents to $1 per pound. Again, depending on the level of hand labor it's going to take or what piece of equipment you might have to get them husked. And then, of course, just some miscellaneous costs from bags to bins to tools to whatever the case may be. And when you subtotal it all up, you get this range here of $1,700 to roughly just over $2,500. And again, just for harvesting and marketing. So those are some of the costs to expect once you get to that stage. What will you do? Okay, so we're going to wrap things up here next Friday, February 24th at 6 p.m. That'll be session 6. We're going to talk about a couple of different things from marketing, some things like that. What do we do now that we've got our nuts harvested? We're starting to process them. How are we going to sell them? And so we're going to talk about some of those things here next time. Wanted to remind you of some of those resources. So this is some of the fact sheets and information from the Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative. So Google midwesthazelnuts.org. A couple of resources here, that Landowner's Guide to Perennial Crop Options, our Upper Midwest Hazelnut Development Initiative website, the Hazelnut Consortium, the Iowa Nut Growers YouTube page, Iowa Hazelnut Project on Facebook, and then, of course, the Iowa Nut Growers Association website. Hey, let's take a quiz. Okay, so when is a hazelnut cluster ready to harvest? Once it turns brown, when the nut falls to the ground, when the nut pops clean from the husk, or when the first nut becomes visible. What do folks think? What answer best describes? Because maybe. Exactly. When the nut pops clean from the husk. So when the nut falls to the ground, it's probably too late. The nuts falling to the ground is too late for us. We want to get them before they fall to the ground. Yes, once it turns brown is an indication, but it might be a little misleading. What you need to do is try to pop that nut from the cluster, and if it does, it's ripe and ready to go. Okay, next question. What is another name for the husk? What is another name for the husk? Involucre, pericarb, endosperm, or pistillate? We'll give folks just a second there and I'll wet my whistle. And the survey says Involucre. Involucre is another name for the hazelnut husk. Okay. We talked about some of those various pieces of equipment for processing hazelnuts. So name one of those pieces of processing equipment. Was one of those pieces a power sifter, a scalper, gravity table, or maybe a torque converter? Gravity table, exactly. That was that machine, the unit from the old pecan processing factory. Okay, name one of the processing challenges that we are faced with. Is it sizing the nuts? Is it too salty of nuts? Is it too large of nuts? Or small pieces of husk that are stuck on the nut? What do folks think on that one? That's right, exactly. Small pieces of husk stuck on the nut is the right answer. And bonus follow-up, who knows what that's called? What do we call that cut or that fraction? Yes, exactly. Stick-ons. That's what those stick-ons are all about. Those in-shell nuts that have that small piece of husk stuck on. Okay, good job. This is the last one, so we want to know pellicle is another name for what? Is it skin? Root tips? A round object? Or the male pollen shedders? What do folks think pellicle is another name for? That's right. It's another name for skin. It's that skin that's right around the kernel that's on the inside of the in-shell nut. It's that little kind of brown piece of skin. That's the pellicle. Okay. Hey, you have all been great this evening. I want to thank you for joining us for session 5 of the Hazelnut Academy. This is coming to an end. You guys have been a great group, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Of course, this will be recorded, so we'll get this posted here sometime over the weekend so you can enjoy it and share with your friends.